So I'm calling this dementia. And I'm calling it dementia because I'm talking about the information domain. We seem to not be thinking clearly, right? Our memories are affected. Our motivation is being influenced. Our thinking has become troubled because of so much misinformation and disinformation and our inability to actually find truth in the middle of all this. And adversaries that are out there, opponents that want to misuse the information domain for their purposes, clearly create a lot of confusion and chaos. And I think those two countries see that they can actually reconstitute the world order after the worst of this trending has played itself out, and they will have a large voice in deciding exactly how the world will interoperate in the future. The Chinese will continue to view all of their choices as ones made out of sort of this victim mentality, when in fact the victim is becoming the abuser here. And so this question about whether or not we're going to face a new form of Chinese colonialism here, China wants to throw those labels only to the West. And I believe that if you're looking at the situation, then in fact China of today and tomorrow is growing into another phase of a great power becoming a very colonial-like power. Are they trying to reconstitute a tributary system with others? Yes. Do they mean for other countries to be more dependent on China? Very clearly, yes. And it's designed to create that influence that they think that they need to be the strongest pole in a multipolar world. That's China's ambition, and that's sort of a perspective on where they're going. It's a pleasure to be here. I used to live in Japan, down in Yokosuka, when I was with the 7th Fleet staff. That was over 20 years ago. It's always good to be back in Japan, and I was really thriving walking around the city and just seeing how things are clean, well organized, just a very modern town with so much rich culture and history. So it's great to be back. I thought maybe what I would do in the beginning here is just to talk about the backdrop. I think people tend to rush right into the crises. Tell me about Taiwan. Tell me about the South China Sea. And if you just give me a little bit of time, I do think that it's important to go macro to micro. And so what I wanted to do was talk about some general trends that we're seeing in the geostrategic environment. You guys all know these very well, but I think I'll say them out loud. First of all, as much as we never wanted to see the planet sort of devolve into a deglobalized state, this is what's occurring today. So we are facing a post-peak globalization planet that now is operating essentially under new rules of the game. And we can go back and describe how we got there, but I would tell you that it's in no small part due to Chinese predatory policies and not operating as a responsible actor in the global system. And when one country of that size becomes very zero-sum and mercantilist, then it has very strong repercussions for many other countries that are interdependent with that one country. And so we will end up having to deal with the realities that Chinese policies may not substantially change, but certainly the world is changing to respond to those. And the aggregate term to describe it is deglobalization. And I think what you'll find is that there'll be fragmentation into different blocks. Free peoples will probably have free trade with other free peoples, but free peoples will probably have to manage their trade with unfree or authoritarian governments, and that's just going to have to be the way of the world. New sets of rules for a changed environment. And the second major trend, I would say, is destabilization. If you're looking at the Middle East and you're looking at Gaza and Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis and all the rest, clearly we have uncertainty as to when we will re-achieve some stability there. In Europe, obviously the chaos surrounding everything because of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And now in this part of the world here, which is supposed to be the engine of the 21st century in terms of economic growth, We have a far more destabilized region, which could in fact be even more destabilized because of all these friction points and flashpoints that are becoming much more likely to actually flare into something that would be very dangerous for all countries involved. Deglobalized, destabilized planet, and then population issues are also kind of on the horizon here. So unless you're in sub-Saharan Africa, where the population is on the rise, almost everywhere on the planet you find that the population growth is declining. These are different kinds of population stresses than what people imagined even a few years ago when they were studying what would happen to the planet and our resources. And so what does this mean in terms of economic growth, economic potential, and other implications are very serious. And the fourth one, I think maybe you'll talk about this after I'm done, and maybe you'll say this is not a good description, but I couldn't find another DE word to go with depopulation, destabilization, and deglobalization. So I'm calling this dementia. And I'm calling it dementia because I'm talking about the information domain. We seem to not be thinking clearly, right? Our memories are affected. Our motivation is being influenced. Our thinking has become troubled because of so much misinformation and disinformation and our inability to actually find truth in the middle of all this. And adversaries that are out there, opponents that want to misuse the information domain for their purposes, clearly create a lot of confusion and chaos. And so this information domain, the information sphere, becomes very important if you are going to pursue any sort of concerted action to deal with the other macro trends that I talked about, and you can't actually rely on good information and communicate that to your people and operate off of facts to be able to pursue your courses of action, then you will not achieve them. You will find everything is much harder to achieve if people can't agree on the basic facts. Those are the four trends defining our 21st century, and many of them are not headed in the right direction. You know, when you hear Xi Jinping and Putin talk about this, they are excited that this is a new era, right, the likes of which they have not seen in 100 years. And I think they see that because of all these trends, some of which that they're abetting, that they can advantage themselves and they can pursue their ambitions in a way that they haven't been able to for some amount of time. And so this sort of disintegration that's occurring, the likes of Putin and Xi see that they have an advantage to maybe take advantage of their long-held ambitions to achieve things in their respective spheres of influence, but also to then maybe play a role in reconstructing what the world will look like after we have this period of chaos that I think we're headed towards, right? There is a shifting that is occurring, and I think those two countries see that they can actually reconstitute the world order after the worst of this trending has played itself out, and they will have a large voice in deciding exactly how the world will interoperate in the future, right? So those are the macro trends, and I wanted to get those out in the beginning because if you begin too small focused, I'm afraid that you can't contextualize really the major issues at hand and how it all fits together. And sometimes, like Eisenhower said in the past, you have to blow up the problem in order to see it clearly. You have to get in the balloon and go up to 50,000 feet and then look down because you'll see how everything is interconnected. Okay, so maybe we'll focus a little bit on China just for a second. It's well known to everybody that the Chinese are embarking on their rejuvenation, that there are sovereignty issues that are connected into the rejuvenation, that China feels like it has many opportunities to advance where it wants to resolve issues, including over Taiwan, but it's not only Taiwan, and that they have a right to take center stage. That's where they've always belonged. And it was an anomaly that you had Western powers that were, in fact, controlling the nature of the international system for the last 200, 300 years. And so I think the Chinese believe that history is on their side, that culture is on their side, that they have power indices that are on their side, and the growth in military power, along with economic power, in their view, can be used to manipulate situations and conditions to be able to allow them to move forward. Ultimately, when you take a look at a socialist Marxist system like the one that exists with the Chinese Communist Party in power, they obviously want to create room and space for them to survive a very hostile world. I think some China hands are very apologist with regard to, well, they're only operating this way out of defense because they want to protect themselves and they see that others mean to do them harm. But at what point does these defensive actions, right, to create your own protective bubble, then create something that others would interpret as offensive? And I think that's kind of where we are. The Chinese will continue to view all of their choices as ones made out of sort of this victim mentality, when in fact the victim is becoming the abuser here. And so this question about whether or not we're going to face a new form of Chinese colonialism here, China wants to throw those labels only to the West, and I believe that if you're looking at the situation, then in fact China of today and tomorrow is growing into another phase of a great power becoming a very colonial-like power. Are they trying to reconstitute a tributary system with others? Yes. Do they mean for other countries to be more dependent on China? Very clearly, yes. And it's designed to create that influence that they think that they need to be the strongest pole in a multipolar world. That's China's ambition, and that's sort of a perspective on where they're going. Somebody would say, well, does this mean that we're in a new Cold War? And I looked up the definition of Cold War, and everything that is described is in play today. You can look up the definition on your own. So as much as some Cold War deniers want to say, well, it's really different, that can't be a Cold War because you'll use all of the techniques that were applied in the 20th century and the 21st century, and that wouldn't be appropriate. I would say to those folks, listen, the magnitude of this problem is exactly the magnitude of the problem that we faced against the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And the nature of the situation is the same, but the character is different, right? There have been many great powers over time exerting rivalry and affecting all other states. That has occurred multiple times, in past millennia, and those have been essentially Cold War equivalents, and we face in the 21st century a Cold War equivalent. You can call it whatever you like, a great struggle or something else, but that's what we have. And until we recognize, in fact, the massiveness of this problem, I think countries are going to struggle with trying to muster up the ability to communicate the danger to their populations and be able to get organized for success. So let me shift for a second on risk scenarios now that we've talked about very uncomfortable issues here in the room. I can read your body language, say these are really tough descriptors here. There are more risks in this fragmented world, and they are not solely centered on Taiwan. I find Taiwan discussions take all the oxygen out of the room. It's very important. We need to talk about it. We will. But if you permit for a second, I'd like to actually go look at the Chinese border and just go west to east, and then we'll ultimately end up in this part of the world in East Asia, and we'll talk about flashpoints. But first of all, you have to understand that there's a general sense that the Chinese need to recover much of their so-called lost territories. They're looking at the greatest expanse of Chinese empires, and they are trying to do things in a very steady, measured way, a boiling frog kind of approach to be able to recover those territories. So what you find in the China Seas is no different than what you might find when you take a look at other parts of the Chinese border. There's a phenomena that's occurring which needs to be connected, which few people are. And I would encourage people to truly take a look at the Chinese psyche and the approach, which is clearly manifesting itself. So if you're looking at the Sino-Indian border, right, you have to take a look at the Ladakh region, and you have to say, what made China push out and try to move at a time when Sino-Indian relations strategically were in a good place? Why would you ruin those relationships. And it turns out that, in fact, the Chinese obsession with sovereignty and recovering, these territories is having multiple actors within the Chinese system really try to do things that, in fact, would achieve some of those ambitions. And so I think that's how you need to take a look at it. And it's worth restudying exactly how Xi Jinping takes a look at Mao's ambitions to, in fact, recover the Five Fingers areas, right? So if Tibet is the palm, as Mao Zedong in the 1930s and 40s talked about it, then the Five Fingers are essentially 3 Indian territories: Ladakh, Sikkim, and Arunachal Pradesh, right? And then Nepal and Bhutan, between those 3 territories. That is thousands of miles of territory, and China is not dissatisfied with recovering Tibet, but is taking a look at claims on significant portions of Bhutan. You know about the cities that are actually inside the Bhutanese border. The influence in Nepal is very strong, some of the activities that you see there, and clearly, a significant amount of military power, a significant amount of infrastructure building up in all those areas with the aim to essentially try to revivify some of those dreams that Mao Zedong had at the greatest extent of the Mongol and the Manchu empires, those dynasties, right? And so let's not be solely focused only in littorals in East Asia, because there's a larger effort that may be slow-moving, but slow-moving doesn't mean it's any less dangerous with regard to Chinese ambitions. So understanding how this is part of a larger push is really important. Okay, so we'll shift over a very deep amount of influence the Chinese have been exerting in Southeast Asia and the Mekong and all the rest. That will continue. Everyone probably is well schooled on how much China works with the warlords in Burma, extending their influence down, and the depth of their activities there. So look, the Chinese buffers are pushing out and essentially compromising some of the sovereign choices that many of these nations used to have. And it's a threat of different colors, but it's still a threat all the same. And each country is going to have to manage that, differently. And if they do so independently, my concern is that that won't be good enough. China would love to be able to only deal with these things bilaterally, where they maintain all of the advantages. This is a time when many states need to work together as a coalition to be able to push back in some of these areas. Okay, so we'll go into the South China Sea, and clearly everybody watches China's activities and says, you got to be kidding me. Even with video of bullying and boarding and water cannoning and lasering and other forms of intimidation, whether on the radio or using the air forces, that the Chinese behavior is not changing. How could it change? How do we get China to change? Or do we simply have to swallow the idea that whatever China wants might means right, and you're going to have to sort of respond? And unless you have enough might, then you're going to have to concede at some point. And this is a very real challenge that all the Southeast Asian rim nations, feel today. What does it take for China to be conditioned into more responsible actions? And so far, embarrassment or shaming hasn't actually deterred their activities. And the same may be true of exposure of their activities in the East China Sea with the Senkakus, where, once again, the Chinese are trying to establish effective control. The Chinese are very obsessed with control, with de facto control over these areas with the Coast Guard and militia, supported by the PLA Navy and Air Forces just on the horizon. So this is the new way of China's approach. As they become more powerful, these issues will become more dire. And the question is, whether or not China's appetite grows, with the eating. If they are not held accountable, if there's no penalty for actually using these tactics, then why would you change them, right? If you're Chinese, if you're not paying a price, then you're just going to drive forward. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here, is that strength hasn't met strength with sufficient power yet to be able to shape the Chinese. And that brings you to whether or not the Chinese will continue to push and push and push on Taiwan, and whether or not they see an opening to be able to, have the political resolution that they're looking for, which is an annexation or assimilation of Taipei, much like Hong Kong. And so what you see is many nations very concerned about this, including the United States, Japan, Australia, Philippines, many others. And so the question is whether or not, at least on this one, that there'll be enough available strength and the cost-benefit analysis, the Chinese take a look at it and they decide not to go and do something drastic. And if they do something drastic, clearly the studies have already been done, that it would be highly disruptive to the entire world. It would eliminate 10% of GDP. $10 trillion worth of wealth is going to be lost if China decides that they can physically take over Taiwan. So those are some of the flashpoint areas, but they're not the only ones. There's competition that could prove even more testy in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. If you take a look at the way the Chinese are pressing forward there and where friction points are already growing. And so there's lots to talk about in here. Somebody would say, well, that was a pretty bleak conversation there, Mr. Studeman. What do you think we ought to do about it? And let me give you a couple of thoughts and then open it up for questions. First of all, I do think that for governments like that we see in Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and other client states, I think Venezuela, Cuba's, that strength needs to be registered against strength in a way that actually forestalls aggressors from wanting. That strength needs to be registered against strength in a way that actually forestalls aggressors from wanting to move forward. And until we realize, once again, that things haven't changed overly much, and that actually a very strong military or coalition of militaries is important to actually secure the peace, not because we want to fight a war, but because it secures the peace. Until we have that epiphany in more places, I'm afraid that our buildup of our military strength will be insufficient to the need. Secondly, that strength also shows up in political capitals. And the Chinese are very effective in using their economic strength to be able to erode political will in certain capitals. They're very good at corrupting business and political elites. And so this question of where states find their political will to be able to actually protect their sovereign spaces and to do so hand in hand with other countries becomes a major factor. And China will be sensing not just military strength, not just political strength, but all of the strengths along the way as nations deploy their instruments of national power. So economic power becomes an important component. Are you so beholden to the Chinese that you're over-leveraged by them? Or have you de-risked in a way that allows you to friendshore, to secure your supply chain, and not essentially be held hostage economically by the Chinese? These are choices that countries are going to have to make as we deal with the situation I've described. I also believe that we need to be much more focused on counterintelligence. I'm an intelligence officer, so I perhaps have a little bit more sensitivity to the value of it than most people. But if China intends to be the most supreme technological power on the planet as they intend to, and be self-reliant, and you take a look at how they would combine that technology with their ambitions, that becomes a very scary place here in the world. And so how do you protect your technology from Chinese predatory practices, from the thieving, the super thieving that they're doing around the world? And this comes back to some very basic things. Some of it's regulation on the cyber front, some of it's having enough cyber defense capability. Japan is talking about active cyber defense here today, I think appropriately, because you're going to need all of that and more, plus a cadre of people that are maybe not just government people, but also private businesses that can help individual companies protect their intellectual property. You can't do that with uniformed people alone. It's not big enough. So how companies think through insider threats, outside threats, that could come from hostile cyber attacks, those things really matter. And I think we have devalued intelligence and counterintelligence at our peril, and you find many companies who have been penetrated, and the Chinese have taken that technology and created this juggernaut of a capability that you see today in the People's Liberation Army. I also believe that our entertainment industries have not yet done us a favor with regard to describing the China of today, or even the world of today. And there are lots of reasons for that. People want to sell their movies in the China market. Some American companies are owned by Chinese producers and things like that. until the entertainment industry actually finds its courage, finds its ability to see that movies about the real China of today will in fact profit, we will have essentially a deaf and dumb entertainment industry that will not help society see the dangers as they exist. So many people in the intelligentsia or in the political or diplomatic and military worlds, they understand the dangers that China poses, Russia poses, etc. But without the entertainment industry to truly educate our populations, I'm afraid we'll always be a step behind. And then maybe I'll end on this. The information instrument is being underutilized by almost every country on the planet except for the adversary, predatory countries out there. And so the question is, when are we going to organize for success to be able to find our voice and to be able to have steady, calm, balanced, objective conversations about the dangers that all of our countries face and what to do about them? Because if you don't have that information instrument working, then societies like mine in the United States will devolve into this sort of isolationist, inward, your neighbor is your enemy sort of thing, because they don't understand what actually is at risk and what's at stake. And so governments need to be able to strategically communicate to their own populations, and we need to do so across kind of the global scene. And unfortunately right now, if you're judging whose information instruments are the strongest, Chinese propaganda, Russian propaganda, their media tentacles throughout the planet are frankly driving much of the narratives. In fact, many in the global south believe, because there isn't a counter-narrative and there's a relatively weak opposing information instrument that is trying to wage the truth on any given day. So those are some thoughts. I've given you enough material for you to ask some really tough questions here. Feel free to push back, but I would offer that up as the way to begin this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights. Very